They carried his body to the throne room, not to bury him, not to mourn him, but to crown him again. The king was dead, yet his final command was clear. He would not be lowered into the earth. He would sit, even in death, as the eternal ruler of his people. Servants dressed his corpse in royal robes. A crown was pressed onto a skull that no longer breathed. The guards bowed. Courtiers trembled. The throne became a coffin made of wood and gold. Day after day, petitioners entered the hall. They bent their knees not to a man, but to a husk of one. His hollow sockets stared down on them. Orders were spoken, not by him, but in his name. Words carried from lips long rotted. And then the crown slipped. The bone cracked against the stone floor. The king's skull split before his kingdom. Was this devotion or madness? A ruler ruling from beyond the grave, or a people too afraid to let him go? Power leaves a man the moment breath does, or so most believe. But this king refused the order of nature. He would not allow worms or soil to claim him. His body, he declared, was still the throne. His bones were still the law, and his kingdom would obey, even when his heart no longer beat. The command came before his final breath. Witnesses say he summoned his council and spoke with a voice already hollowed by illness. "When I am gone," he said, "I will not lie in earth like common men. I will sit, robed and crowned, so no enemy dares to think me absent. My throne is eternal, and my eyes will never close upon my people." The courtiers did not dare protest. Some thought it madness. Others saw in it a terrible wisdom. If the king's enemies believed him still present, still commanding, fear alone could preserve order. But there was more. A whisper passed among the people. He was not simply ruling after death. He was binding them in chains stronger than iron. The day of his death, the palace was sealed. No bells tolled. No mourning processions filled the streets. Instead, servants worked feverishly to dress the body. Royal tailors stitched silks around stiffening limbs. A crown of gold pressed against a brow already cooling. Rings slid onto fingers that no longer resisted. And then, slowly, reverently, they carried him to the great hall. There he sat, a corpse upon a throne. Torches flickered, shadows danced, and a dead man gazed upon the living. The kingdom's most powerful bowed low, terrified to lift their heads. For if they questioned him now, they would be questioning his command from beyond the grave. And what punishment could meet that sin? At first it worked. The court carried on as if nothing had changed. Messengers brought petitions. Decrees were read in the king's name. Guards saluted his rotting form every morning. His enemies outside the walls hesitated. For who would dare raise arms against a sovereign who had defied death itself? But bodies do not respect crowns. Days became weeks, and decay could not be hidden. Perfumes were burned, herbs scattered, wrappings tightened. Still, the smell crept through the hall like a whisper of truth. And one by one, the courtiers began to wonder, was this loyalty or a theater of horror? The people were summoned to witness. Villagers walked barefoot across marble floors, clutching gifts, bowing to a ruler whose teeth grinned without flesh. Some fainted. Others kissed the steps leading to the throne, desperate to prove devotion. Mothers covered their children's eyes, while priests muttered prayers under their breath. But none dared to speak against it, for the king had sworn he would watch forever. And if his corpse could not keep its crown, what curse would fall upon them all? The crown became a symbol of dread. Balanced on a skull that had once held ambition, it gleamed with menace. Guards checked it constantly, terrified it might slip, for to let it fall would be seen as betrayal. Yet fate needs no traitors. One day, as the people gathered in hushed fear, the weight shifted. Metal scraped bone, and then with a hollow echo, the crown slid, struck the floor, and cracked the skull beneath. The hall fell silent. The king's jaw shattered. A piece of his face rolled down the steps. And in that moment, devotion curdled into terror. Still, his council did not bury him. Instead, they set the fragments back upon the throne, as if trying to stitch eternity back together. They whispered, "The king still rules. The king still sees." But every eye that gazed upon that broken skull knew the truth. What sat before them was not power, but the husk of fear itself. When a man dies, a kingdom expects closure. The ground opens, the body is lowered, and grief makes way for succession. But here the cycle broke. Death did not end rule. It extended it, twisted it, made it something unnatural. The throne became a tomb, and the tomb a throne, and the people lived under the shadow of bones. In the beginning, the council whispered that this was strength. They spread the story that their sovereign had conquered mortality, that no blade or sickness could silence him. Messengers rode through villages with proclamations. The king watches still, his gaze is eternal, and the peasants, desperate for stability, Sokorinene believed. For what is harder to imagine than a ruler who cannot die? If a living king inspired fear, a dead one inspired awe. But the truth behind palace walls was uglier. The body required constant tending. Servants were assigned to wash away the fluids that seeped from beneath his robes. Priests sprinkled incense until their lungs burned. Rats were trapped and killed for feasting too near the throne. Every dawn, the guards rehearsed their salutes with trembling hands, praying the skull would not collapse further when they raised their swords. Over time, devotion turned ritualistic, even grotesque. Nobles would bring their disputes before the skeleton. They bowed, pleaded their case, then waited for silence, because silence itself was now treated as law. Afterward, the council would interpret the king's decision, twisting the absence of words into rulings that served their schemes. The corpse became a puppet, the perfect mask behind which power could hide. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some swore the king's eyes still glowed faintly at night, tiny sparks within hollow sockets. Others claimed his jaw moved, teeth clattering as if forming words. A widow in the countryside swore she heard his voice carried on the wind, ordering her to obey his will. Whether true or not, fear gave these stories weight. The people convinced themselves he lingered, and in convincing themselves, they chained their own minds. Yet reality was harder to deny. Farmers who were summoned to the palace came back pale, whispering of the stench that clung to their clothes. Children who peeked into the throne room screamed at night, haunted by the grin of a fleshless king. Priests argued in secret, was this devotion or blasphemy? Some declared the throne had become an idol of death, that the kingdom bowed not to a ruler, but to rot. But none dared speak openly. To question the king was to risk sharing his eternity, in chains, in silence, beneath the throne. The crown itself became cursed. No one touched it without gloves, for fear that contact with the king's relic would mark them for death. Stories multiplied. A guard who polished the crown collapsed the next day. A maid who brushed dust from the throne lost her voice forever. These tales spread terror, making the corpse's authority absolute. Even in pieces, he commanded obedience. And yet cracks appeared, not only in bone but in belief. Behind closed doors, nobles mocked the charade. Some plotted to place their own candidates forward, to finally bury the skeleton and seize the throne. But each attempt met sudden ruin. One nobleman was found hanged in his chamber, his tongue black as if poisoned. Another was trampled by his own horses on the road. The whispers grew. Perhaps the king punished disloyalty from beyond the grave. What was true? What was fear? The lines blurred until even the council believed the lie they had created. They too bowed, not only for appearances, but for terror. They too avoided the throne after dark, fearing the echo of footsteps when no one stood behind them. The corpse, once meant to intimidate outsiders, had begun to devour those within. Thus the kingdom lived in limbo, not alive, not dead. Each sunrise began with trumpets saluting a jawless king. Each sunset ended with incense clouds masking rot. A people bowed to a throne of bones, too afraid to bury him, too broken to move on. And through it all, one question haunted every whisper. If the king still ruled, who among them truly dared to live? The throne room had become a mausoleum. What was once a place of judgment and law transformed into a theater of decay. And still, every day the rituals continued. Petitions were read aloud to the corpse, proclamations were issued in his name, and the kingdom's heartbeat slowed to match the silence of its master. For outsiders, the tale was madness. Neighboring rulers mocked in whispers, calling it a circus of bones. But none dared laugh too loudly, for the spectacle of a king ruling from the grave carried its own kind of terror. Envoys sent to negotiate returned pale and shaken. Some swore that when they bowed, the air grew colder, as if the corpse itself leaned closer. A few refused to re-enter the hall altogether, insisting that they had heard the creak of the king's jaw as though he had spoken. The council, drunk on their hidden power, reinforced the myth. Every law, every tax, every punishment was declared as the king's will. Dissidents were dragged before the throne, forced to kneel under the empty gaze of sockets, and sentenced to death by silence. The corpse's presence made rebellion unthinkable. To rise against the council was to rise against eternity itself. And eternity has no mercy. Over time, the rituals grew more elaborate and more grotesque. Priests began to chant daily before the throne, praising the king not just as ruler, but as an immortal spirit who guided the land. His crown was no longer gold. It was relic. His bones, relics. His silence, scripture. Families traveled miles to bring offerings, grain, animals, even trinkets carved from their dead. These were laid at the throne's steps, as if payment to a god who watched from the other side. The children who grew up in this kingdom never knew a living sovereign. For them, a skeleton in robes was not horror, it was normalcy. They bowed as their parents bowed, kissed marble floors that smelled of rot, and learned to fear the gaze of hollow eyes. And when they asked why the king did not speak, the answer was simple. He does not need to. His silence is enough. But silence breeds interpretation. Over the years, factions emerged, each claiming to understand the corpse's will better than the others. Some priests said the king's stillness meant patience, justice delayed until perfect. Others argued it meant anger. He waited for offerings, for more devotion. The council twisted silence into whichever decree gave them more control, and so the people obeyed not a king, but 1,000 imagined versions of him. Yet nature gnawed at the myth. Time spared no corpse, not even one clothed in gold. Flesh had long since vanished. Tendons turned to dust. Bones dried and cracked. The skull, once crowned, bore a fracture that deepened each season, as though mocking the idea of eternity. Servants worked endlessly to patch him, binding limbs with silk, sewing bones into place, polishing him with oils. But they could not hide what he truly was. The throne was not occupied by power. It was occupied by ruin. Still, fear bound the kingdom tighter than any crown. When famine struck, the priests declared it punishment for wavering faith. When plague spread, the council proclaimed it a test of loyalty to the king. And when enemies at the border threatened war, messengers shouted, "Our king still rules, unbroken, unburied. He commands us even from beyond." The people believed because not believing meant confronting the nightmare truth, that they were ruled by nothing but decay. There were moments of rebellion. A soldier once tried to strike the throne with his sword, screaming that he would end the charade. The blade shattered against the armrest. He was seized, dragged to the dungeon, and by dawn his head hung on the city gates. Whispers said the king's spirit himself had snapped the steel, defending his eternal reign. Another time, a servant refused to bow during ceremony. He was never seen again. In his place, a new guard stood at the throne, saluting with mechanical precision, eyes glazed as if his will had been stolen. The legend began to bleed beyond the palace walls. Parents warned children that if they disobeyed, the dead king would rise in the night and watch them. Songs were written, dark hymns of bones and silence, that echoed in taverns and fields. Merchants carried stories to distant lands of a ruler who had cheated the grave. And thus what began as horror hardened into myth. The king was no longer a man. He was a symbol, unyielding, unstoppable, and untouchable. And yet at the heart of it all sat a corpse propped by silk. His ribs cracked under their wrappings. His jaw hung loose, barely tethered by thread, and his crown, once dazzling, bore dents from its fall. Visitors who dared look too long saw not power but fragility. Still they bowed, because fear had long replaced sight. The cycle was complete. The living obeyed the dead justified the living's cruelty, and the throne, meant to inspire stability, had become a monument to madness. But what happens when a kingdom grows used to death as law? What happens when silence becomes the loudest voice in the land? The answer was coming, and it would shatter more than bone. Every throne eventually buckles under its own weight. For years, the corpse king's silence had been interpreted as law, his decay disguised as divine endurance. But time is a patient enemy, and no crown can hide the truth of rot forever. The first collapse came not in rebellion, but in doubt. Among the priests, whispers began to grow louder. One asked, "If our king rules eternally, why do crops wither? Why do plagues strike us while he sits untouched?" Another dared to suggest, perhaps his silence is not wisdom, but emptiness. These doubts were quickly silenced, of course. Some priests disappeared into the dungeons. Others were found dead in alleys, their lips sewn shut as warning. But doubt, once seated, is harder to kill than flesh. The people, too, began to notice what could no longer be hidden. They brought offerings, but returned with the smell of death clinging to their clothes. Children asked why the king's hands were brittle sticks, why his eyes were nothing but hollow holes. Mothers offered no answer except a command: bow lower, do not look. Fear taught obedience, but it could not erase curiosity. And children, unlike their parents, had not yet learned to confuse terror with loyalty. The councils sensed the change. They tightened their grip, staging larger ceremonies, more elaborate parades, insisting the corpse still watched, still judged. They even propped his skull higher with wires, disguising the fracture with jewels. But each attempt only deepened the grotesque image. A dead king held together, not by power, but by desperation. When the crown slipped a second time, the hall erupted in gasps. This time, the skull shattered further, scattering bone across marble steps. Courtiers screamed, some fainted, others fled. The council rushed forward, scrambling to collect the fragments, as if eternity itself could be glued back together. They stitched the remains into the robes, hiding absence beneath silk. But everyone who had witnessed it knew something irreversible had broken. From that day, visits to the throne no longer carried awe. They carried dread. Subjects entered with downcast eyes, terrified not of the king's power, but of the grotesque spectacle that awaited them. The myth of immortality faltered. The image of authority became a corpse collapsing in slow motion, witnessed by thousands. Outside the palace, rebellion brewed. Farmers muttered that they served not a ruler, but a carcass. Soldiers, once proud to guard their sovereign, grew restless. What honor was there in defending bones? The very fear that had bound them began to dissolve, replaced by a deeper, quieter rage. But the council could not let go. To bury him was to admit weakness, to risk losing the terror that kept the kingdom in chains. So they doubled down. They declared the shattered skull a divine omen, that even broken, the king had chosen to remain. They commanded sculptors to carve likenesses of him as skeletal yet holy, statues of bone crowned with gold, erected across the land. And so the corpse was multiplied, not one throne of rot, but hundreds, scattered like a plague of idols. Still, the weight grew heavier. The council had chained themselves to the very corpse they used to control others. Each day they sat beneath the empty gaze of sockets, inventing new decrees, convincing themselves he still guided them. Yet in their private chambers, they argued, panicked, accused one another. The king they served was not ruling them from beyond. His silence had become their prison, and for the people, silence no longer meant power. It meant the absence of life, the absence of hope. Something had to break, and when it did, it would not only bury a corpse, it would bury an empire built on bones. The kingdom had lived too long in the shadow of bones. What once inspired awe now bred disgust. The throne room, once sacred, stank of decay despite incense and perfumes. Petitioners no longer lifted their eyes when entering, afraid of glimpsing the truth, that the king was nothing but a skeleton dressed in fading robes, propped upright by wire and willful lies. The second fall of the crown had done more than shatter bone. It shattered belief. In taverns and markets, voices grew bold. Farmers mocked the council's decrees, calling them the whispers of worms. Children carved crude figures of a grinning skull, laughing instead of bowing. Fear had cracked, and through the cracks, rebellion seeped. The council fought desperately to seal the fractures. They staged processions carrying relics of the king, fragments of bone displayed in gilded boxes, paraded through streets as if holy. Priests declared visions that the king's spirit demanded more offerings, more obedience, but each spectacle rang hollow. The more they tried to prove eternity, the more obvious the fraud became. Even the guards, sworn protectors of the throne, began to waver. Some whispered of abandoning their posts. Others spat when commanded to salute the corpse. And when the council ordered executions to silence these doubts, the soldiers hesitated. A few even defected, vanishing into the countryside to join the murmurs of revolt. The corpse itself betrayed its keepers. No longer intact, it slumped lower with each season. Bones splintered, fingers dropped to the floor unnoticed. The jaw dangled crooked, incapable of holding even the illusion of a smile. Servants scrambled to reassemble the fragments, but it was like patching sand with silk. Each attempt made the spectacle more grotesque. The people began to ask dangerous questions. If their king was eternal, why did his body crumble? If his silence was wisdom, why did famine still devour the land? If he truly ruled, why did the council speak louder than the corpse itself? Questions became whispers. Whispers became defiance, and defiance soon reached the gates of the palace. The council clung to their fiction. They declared that decay itself was proof of the king's sacrifice, that he was consuming himself for his people. But no decree could mask the stench of reality. The throne, once a symbol of immortality, now stood as a monument to denial. And then came the night that would break everything. During a grand ceremony, with nobles, priests, and commoners gathered to offer their allegiance, the throne shifted. The skeleton lurched sideways, robes tearing as ribs cracked audibly in the silence. The body collapsed, sliding down the throne steps in a heap of bone and silk. Gasps turned to screams. Mothers shielded their children. Guards froze, eyes wide with horror. The crown rolled across the marble floor, spinning in mocking circles before settling at the feet of the people. The illusion had ended. No wires could repair it. No incense could disguise it. What lay before them was not a king. It was a carcass, broken and defeated. In that moment, the people realized the truth. They had not been ruled by eternity. They had been ruled by fear, and fear, once broken, does not return. The council scrambled, shouting, demanding loyalty, insisting the king's spirit lived on. But their words were drowned by something far greater, the first roar of a crowd unshackled. The cycle of silence had ended. The bones no longer spoke. And for the first time in years, the people's voices did. The throne was empty now, the robes torn, the bones scattered, the crown dented where it had struck the stone. What began as devotion had ended in ruin. The corpse of a king, once worshipped as eternal, lay broken at the feet of those who had feared him. And in the silence that followed, the people did not bow. They stood. They looked at one another. And for the first time, they saw not eternity, but freedom. Yet freedom carried its own dread. For years, they had hidden behind his shadow. Every law, every judgment, every cruelty had been spoken in his name. Without him, without his silence, who now ruled? The council scrambled for power. Priests screamed of curses. Nobles fought to seize the throne. The people, long chained to obedience, now found themselves staring into a void. The corpse had been a prison, but it had also been a shield. And now the shield was gone. Some whispered that the fall of the corpse was not an end, but a beginning. That the king's spirit, denied burial, would never rest. That his curse lingered in every fragment of bone, every jewel in the crown. There were stories of children who touched the marble steps where he collapsed and fell sick, their eyes hollowing as if something looked back through them. Others swore they saw the throne empty by day, but occupied again by night, a shadow in royal robes, seated in silence, as if waiting for the people to remember their fear. The myth of the eternal king did not die with his bones. It grew, feeding on memory. Parents warned their children not to mock his name. Soldiers muttered before battle that his spirit still marched beside them. Priests clung to fragments of skull and rib, declaring them sacred, proof that eternity cannot be broken by dust. And so, though his corpse had fallen, his reign continued, not in body, but in mind. This is the true horror of his command. Death ended his breath, but not his rule. He had infected his kingdom with obedience so deep, so absolute, that even shattered bones could govern. Even silence could issue decrees. Even absence could terrify. And so the people never truly buried him. They buried themselves, in fear, in ritual, in memories of a throne that ruled without life. The final question is not what became of the corpse. It is what became of the living. How long can a people bow to bones before they become bones themselves? How long before silence becomes louder than truth? Perhaps the real curse was not the king who refused to leave the throne, but the world that still kneels to rulers long after they are gone. Even now, across history, how many thrones are still occupied by ghosts?